Welcome to Season 2 of CyberTide Podcast. In each episode, Adlumin hosts guests from across the security industry to dive beneath the headlines and explore the attacks, industry trends, and how small to medium-sized businesses can protect themselves from cyber risk. I'm your host, Mark Sangster, strategist with Adlumin and author of No Safe Harbor, the inside truth about cybercrime and how to protect your business. On this episode, we start a new season of CyberTide with a look back at the summer of 2023. And to join us to discuss much that has happened between threat landscape activity, some of the major breaches we've seen, major events like Black Hat and ILTACON, is our resident threat intelligence expert, Kevin O'Connor, who's Adlumin's threat intelligence team director. Hey, Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Mark. Thanks. It's great to be here today.
Yeah, back again. Here we go. So, just to make sure we level set for everybody, I know you've been on the show before. Spend a few minutes and just tell our listeners about your background and your role with the team.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kevin O'Connor, I'm the director of threat research here at Adlumin. I actually got to start up Adlumin's threat research group about 2 years ago. Before that, I've always kind of been a nerd and a cyber geek. I almost got kicked out of New York City public schools when I was in middle school for hacking the computers. Luckily, they put me in, a diversion program and sent me to Columbia to sort of study how to do IT stuff when I was in middle school. And they had me running, the New York City public school, middle school network and stuff like that. So eventually, went to school, college and all that. I got grabbed by the NSA for an internship and then went to work with them full time. Spent about 10 years there. Got to work a lot of really cool defense missions like commercial solutions for classified. Got to make tablets and iPads for all the senior executives in the government. And then I really found my true passion, right, which everybody loves in the cybersecurity industry, and that's the hacking stuff, right? So I got to go out and do some of the computer network exploitation for the U.S. government to collect foreign intelligence and all that fun stuff. So I've been around the block and I've seen a lot of threat actors sort of, in play. So I'm always excited to talk about them and go over what's going on in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always look forward to having those insights from you. And you're kind of down in the trenches, which I love, right? Because we get to hear the stories that often don't make the headlines. And I know some of the things we're going to talk today about, like Power Drop, for example, in play. We certainly have had some coverage from that, from the research that you and your team have conducted. But before we get there, let's kind of go back for a second. And, why don't we talk a bit about Black Hat, which was, beginning of August down in sweltering Las Vegas. What were some of your observations, maybe memorable moments from the event?
It's actually been 10 years since I've been to my last Black Hat conference, Black Hat DEF CON. So it was quite a shock, actually, coming back to the conference this year and just really honestly seeing the vendor space has completely changed. I mean, Black Hat's always been a lot more commercial and vendor focused, but really the setups and the rooms and displays and stuff that these vendors had were just amazing. I mean, you could get everything from coffee to pizza. They had an area where you could fly drones. I think for some reason, security companies love their F1 racing. So there were, I think, 4 or 5 F1 cars there. I don't know if you got to see them. Yeah, I always think that's crazy. Maybe they should get all 4 of those cars out on the strip and do a drag race one day. But
no kidding.
I thought that was really impressive to me. And then, honestly, it was great to be back at Black Hat and honestly just be with the community and even just working the Adlumin booth there and stuff and just seeing sort of, who comes by and wants to talk. You get to see security people from all different areas and specialties, right? Security, a lot of times, especially in a small to medium business where I work, that middle market, you're dealing with general cybersecurity experts and stuff like that, people who work sort of the whole cybersecurity space. But going to these conferences, you get to meet people who, are incident responders, are threat researchers, have specific specialties in cybersecurity. So it's always good to see what's on their mind.
Yeah, there's a lot of practitioners at that show. I always kind of juxtapose RSA and Black Hat. And, RSA is the very, very commercial, let's call it sales and marketing kind of one, right? And then Black Hat tended to be a bit more practitioner based. And of course, DEF CON, right? That piggybacks along, that's clearly that's the super practitioners. Don't go on the Wi-Fi, don't bring a credit card, all kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting at Black Hat. One of the things I noticed is you're right. It's certainly let's say the engagement that these companies are putting into it has certainly come up astronomically, right? Like you said, crazy over the top booths with, lots of sort of entertainment and ways of bringing people in. But then I noticed some other interesting things and I don't mean this as a criticism, but, for example, they weren't putting carpeting between the booths on the floor. And I know that might sound like a pedantic kind of observation, but it sort of felt a little bit like it was getting back to the roots a little more. It's less about the pizzazz and the show, and the showmanship, and a little bit more about the content, and so I was sort of happy to see that. But it's certainly, I'm going to say Black Hat is rivaling RSA now, in terms of draw, and I'd say that kind of both the financial commitment, but the industry commitment that those players, the big vendors are putting in.
Yeah, I mean, you got to watch out on the floor and make sure you don't trip over any of those power cables running these giant displays. But yeah, actually, I do like the vendor space, and I'll say, like, I haven't been there the past couple years, but talking to everybody who has, it seems like this year was really more of a return to normal, right? Post-COVID, you
Hmm.
saw a lot more people here. I think this was probably, the biggest attendance they've had in the past few years. And what I actually did like about the vendor floor this time versus others, and like I actually do recommend people go and check it out because you get a lot of vendor specific like threat briefs and insights, right? So a lot
Yes.
of the different booths were actually running like rolling briefings, right? Where every hour they would give a brief from their perspective or whatever their specialty is, whether they're an AI company or, it's Trend Micro going over general trends in the industry. And I thought those were actually really helpful because it was an easy way for me to knock out like getting a bunch of sort of, data dump, that fire hose of knowledge, from everybody else that was there.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Again, to kind of contrast some of the other conferences where often you kind of get the dog and pony show, or they bring out a professional speaker, actor, right, who kind of does this very consistent 10-minute routine about their
Yeah.
products and their services, and I guess that's it's what we come to expect. But yeah, what I do like at Black Hat is more of it's the briefing side, right? Again, you have practitioners coming out and talking about the research that they're conducting and findings, and I think that stuff's incredibly interesting because I think for the broader market anyway, and a lot of the market we serve, right, they don't necessarily get access to that. And kind of on a related note, we were also at, now a slightly smaller conference, but still sizable, ILTACON, right, which is the Legal Technology Association's annual conference. And that was in yet another sweltering location of Orlando this time. In August as well. Somehow we have to find places with a little less humidity. But, as we talked about the legal space, you had an opportunity there to join a panel to talk about, kind of the latest threats that we're facing, the legal sector, law firms in particular, and of course, larger industries with their legal groups within them. But, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought, you had incredible audience engagement. There were a lot of people interested in the various stories that you were telling. So, tell us a bit more about what you and your panelists were able to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I love getting to like the industry specific conferences as well, right? Because you can really deep dive into what are the problems facing, those specific companies and stuff like that. So ILTACON was a ton of fun for me. What was really good was actually, so the legal sector really has it together. They have the American Bar Association, right, which everybody knows kind of like runs the lawyers and stuff, but they actually publish a yearly report sort of on like statistics and trends in cybersecurity within the legal industry. And there was just a lot of good figures and statistics they were able to share with the industry, which was things like, the larger the firm size, obviously the more likely they are to have sort of training and stuff like that, like cybersecurity awareness training. But also, it was something like 20 or 21% of legal firms had said that they had been breached in the past year. And that was actually the year before last. And then this year it went up another 2%. So I guess we are seeing, at least a notable increase in exploitations. But yeah, I mean, at that conference, we got to talk about a ton of things. A lot of it was really focused on like what are the inroads for sort of exploitation within the legal sector. And a lot of that covered, your standard spear phishing, SEO, search optimization, and poisoning is obviously a hard issue. Bad links on forums. But we also got to talk some about like some of the 0-day sort of vulnerabilities that have been facing enterprises like this. So, a lot of documents and stuff being shared in the legal industry. They're big users of things like Progress Software's Move It IT, which of course had that 0-day vulnerability that was, first actually discovered and developed by Clop, the ransomware group, who then used it to knock, how many folks overnight. And one of the good stories I do want to share is actually recently one of our Adlumin customers in the legal industry faced a ransomware event. And what was really interesting about this ransomware event, and what I really want to call out to people, is that the way they were exploited with this ransomware is first the ransomware threat actor group, PlayCrypt, went against the MSP, right? So like the IT services provider for this, I would say smaller law firm, small to medium-sized law firm, medium-sized. And what actually happened is they spearphished like the MSP. They got access to the MSP's RMM software, so that remote monitoring and management software that's used to sort of administer computers in their customer networks, and then use that to sort of jump into the legal firm's network and just kind of, run amok and install, malware with administrative privileges using, permitted routes and stuff like that. And it was just a really interesting one.
Yeah, law firms, of course, have become, a sort of a popular target simply because I think they're a good access to all sorts of interesting customer information, right across, they're across all sorts of industries, right. And in a lot of ways, I kind of see them as a bit of a, a crossroads between them, right, or a marketplace where they all come together between, legislation and government and investment and banking and those assets that they buy, like tech firms and biopharm and all these kind of things. But there was one that actually came out late this summer as well, HWL Ebsworth, which is a very prominent law firm in the Southern Hemisphere in Australia. But what was interesting about the story, of course, and this is where I'd really love your opinion, Kevin, is that first they were hit by Alpha 5, which, isn't unusual. And I know these guys, Black Hat or whatever, they're pretty popular at the moment and they seem fairly active. It was more of that sort of secondary extortion of ransomware, I think, where we talked about this, the idea of you're not locking down everything, you're locking down specific things to cripple operations. But then it's more about that multiple approach to extortion, where now you're saying, look, we're gonna expose this data. And what was interesting about that, because that's not unusual, I know, is that they then ran to the courts and they attempted to get a gag order, which obviously is ludicrous in the face of a criminal group that's already stolen their information. Like they're not gonna post it on their leak sites because the court said they can't. But I think really that wasn't the intent. The intent was to stop the media from being able to discuss it. So they found that information. They couldn't name, who's who in the zoo, right? They couldn't come out and say, oh, well, here's which specific law firm clients had actually been affected or, allegedly affected, and, as threatened by Alpha 5. So, I don't know if that'll take off, but, what's your sort of opinion? Do you think this might become a regular tactic that we're going to see?
Yeah, absolutely. So within like the ransomware space, we've actually seen a move for some of the most popular ransomware groups and even some of the upcoming ones, where instead of doing what we call double extortion, right, where they're encrypting the files and then also stealing the data, exfilling it so that they can post it on their leak sites, on the Tor.onion, or even increasingly on the ClearNet as well. We've seen the move from that double extortion to just extortion. So they're actually, some of them are foregoing ransomware encryption, encrypting documents and stuff like that entirely. They're just solely focused on data exfiltration. And the problem with this is it actually leaves less room for detection and stuff, right? So if you're not modifying, bulk modifying hundreds of files or something like that, or deleting files and rewriting them to overwrite the contents, it's more difficult to detect this ransomware because they're sitting there more like an APT, right? A stealthy actor that's sitting there and collecting intelligence. But in this case, the intelligence is really more meant for just release in the media. And I think it's been a huge issue, and I think it's going to continue to be an issue. We saw one of the newer ransomware groups called Bianlian. I think in January they moved to just solely just the single extortion of data exfiltration, and they opened up their leak site. And I go to these leak sites, I index them, I follow them, and I mean it's pretty crazy, right? Like you had mentioned the media, and I mean, when they post these leaks on the darknet, increasingly what they're doing is posting them with like timers, right? So they'll tell the organization, hey, you have 14 days to pay. And part of that so that the organization can get their stuff together, right? And they can figure out where they're getting the money from maybe. But I mean, the other half of it is that it builds up, right? It's kind of like a release. So they'll post on their Twitter or whatever, hey, incoming ransom from this, super cool company. Stay tuned for more. And, that alerts the media, that alerts other attackers who want to go through the data to find, stuff they can use to sell or ways to access the network and compromise it themselves. And it's really cool, but really scary. And I'll say with like the leaks, right? Like we saw, this is in the education space, but I think it was like Minnesota or one of the southern states. They actually like went to the media. So I don't know if it was Alpha 5, but it was one of the bigger ransomware groups that actually like did a recording. So they showed like a video recording of, the hacker, air quotes, going through the data dump of all the stolen data on his laptop. And they had, the over the shoulder sort of looking at it. And they're just trying to drum up and build, publicity, because the more publicity that a leak has, the more likely it is the victim's going to have to pay, right? Because they don't want that data then to be exposed to millions. I do like the trick that I guess the Australians have pulled to try to get a media blockade on sort of that information. I think usually unless you're one of those FBI's or intelligence community folks, it's hard to get a media blackout.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not sure really how far that will go, right? Because you're right. I mean, obviously the Australian legal system is not similar, but not the same as the U.S. legislation. So there are differences in what they will protect and not protect, and so probably won't play out the same way. But I think it's an interesting tactic nonetheless. And of course, like you said, it just reemphasizes that these kind of groups like BNLang and so on are kind of moving back to this almost traditional 1970s, like here's the pictures in the envelope. If you want the negatives, you got
Yeah.
to pay us kind of approach.
I mean, it's honestly the ransomware game has always been a huge cat and mouse, right? Since the beginning. I mean, it started with, when they would encrypt files with ransomware, they would use like symmetric keys, right, where the key is shared between the host that actually has the files encrypted and then the attackers. So we saw security researchers and AV vendors and stuff find ways to recover these keys so that you could decrypt the data and then no harm, no foul on the ransomware. Well, what the ransomware actors then started to do to defeat this was they started using like asymmetric encryption and stuff, right? Like more public key type stuff where the entire keys for decryption aren't located on the victim machine. So you really do need access to the ransomware actor to get, the complete key to decrypt. Well, then we saw the defenders say, okay, well, what we're going to do is really secure up our shore up our backups and stuff like that. So when there is a ransomware event, we make sure that the backups aren't ransomware, they're not modified, and we can always just recover from those, right? Again, no harm, no foul. Just aside from a little downtime it takes to, restore from those backups. And that's what really led to data extortion, right? They're like, okay, well, now we need to find another way to force these people to pay. If we can't encrypt their files, we're going to need to, start pushing them with these data leaks and stuff. And, we got to that point, and now we're just seeing the movement just to pure data leaks sometimes. So.
Interesting. And of course, over the summer as well, you and your group discovered Power Drop, right, that you mentioned, and then some of the activity you already kind of covered there a little bit at PlayCrypt, right, with that law firm and RMM living off the land type of attacks.
Yeah, Power Drop's actually been a really fun one. We're still investigating this, trying to figure out exactly how widespread the threat is, where else it shows up, and exactly, try to do as best we can attribution towards a threat actor. That was one that we caught going against the aerospace defense industry, and it was very targeted, and it actually has flavors of like supply chain compromise and stuff in it, sort of like the MSP hacking, right? Like that's kind of a supply chain compromise too, because your MSP or your MSSP is really a provider, so. I mean, supply chain. So that's been a fun one. We're still investigating that, and I'm hoping we'll have some good findings to come in the future on it.
Yeah, and of course, while we were at ILTACON as well, right, Adlumin was involved in another talk there where Tim Brown, who was the CISO of SolarWinds, was talking, and of course, that's another major supply chain attack that probably might have been one of the most the first of the big ones a few years ago. An interesting thing that came out of his point too that I thought. From a legal perspective, is he talked about the fact that when the SEC announced an investigation into SolarWinds after the incident, that the CISO and the CFO were personally named, and it was interesting because he kind of talked about how the first thing he had to do was sit down with the CEO and have a conversation about like well, am I representing myself? Are you paying for this? Who's doing this? And it's a kind of you can see the tactic from the regulator, right? Because if the company says, forget it, you're on your own, well, they're probably going to turn, quote, air quotes, state's witness, right?
Yeah.
They're going to cooperate to try and, reduce whatever penalty they may face. And of course, in this case, SolarWinds did do that, and they did cover them, right? And when he talked about it, it's like millions in legal fees, and had there been a settlement with the SEC, that could have been several million, right? So you think about financially how that would cripple and destroy someone. Not to mention the sleepless nights, and I can't imagine the emotional, psychological damage to you and your family and so on. And then of course, long term, let's assume now you're facing legal fees, you've got a big penalty you have to pay. You're probably also unemployed because one of the sanctions that the SEC also puts in place typically in these cases is that you can't serve as an officer of a public company, which means he couldn't be the CISO anymore, right? He'd have had to they'd have to fire him or step him down to some other kind of function, and another person on his team would have had to take over because he couldn't be in a position to represent them. So. It's a lot more complicated than we think. But hey, I wanted to quickly switch. You're just watching the time. Yesterday, one of our colleagues who runs our MSS group, so obviously Miguel Hablutza, who runs our managed services, he and I were addressing the the examiners group. So it's about 200 examiners for the Office of the Comptroller for Currencies, and they're another oversight regulator in the financial, banking industry. And we were talking a little bit about artificial intelligence there. And, one of the questions that came up was about how are criminals using artificial intelligence in terms of, say new phishing lures or determining, identifying vulnerabilities and, just exploiting companies. So maybe you can help us on that one.
Yeah, well, so we talked about Black Hat. I went to Black Hat this year, and that was actually one of the biggest themes throughout Black Hat was really AI, generative AI models, large language models, those LLMs, and how they're being used, in computer network exploitation and stuff. And really, the biggest place that I've seen it so far has been in those phishing messages, like you mentioned. So you can use large language models like ChatGPT to essentially create highly tailored phishing messages, that you can then send to your potential victims. And this might not sound like a big deal, right? Because you can already do this. You can already write these letters, but a lot of these actors don't work in the United States, right? A lot of the ransomware actors come from, Eastern Europe, or they're coming from South American countries, things like that. And their English might not be perfect, and being able to run it through some sort of like Chat GPT to get that perfect English, the polished sort of letter, is really going to help their effectiveness. And then on top of that, when we talk about like potential data exposure through using some of these tools like Chat GPT and the LLMs, it's actually been published. You can run your own LLM, right? Like I run one at home, so I run my own like Chat GPT version, right? And all you need is a beefy video card, to be honest, and they're based off the llama models and all that. But the benefit of that is you can actually feed it your own data. So let's say you had some preliminary data on the company, or you had scrapes of LinkedIn and Facebook. You can feed that to these LLMs, and then it'll predictively generate text that might be targeted towards a specific individual, right? Imagine scraping every LinkedIn for somebody in the company, and then just asking your version of ChatGPT, like who's in charge of this system, and then what do I say to them? And it automatically knows based on the context, right, and like the word probabilities and all that this person really loves to talk about whatever TV show, and then you use that as your opening lure. So I think that's been a really big space. And then the other really big side of it, aside from spear phishing, has really just been in development, right, and assisting development and lowering that barrier to entry for complex development needed for malware and stuff like that. One of the biggest places we've seen use of this are in things like GitHub Copilot, right, which is another generative language model. And you could also use ChatGPT for the same thing. And I think these, while they can't like develop malware on their own and stuff, they can certainly help you and aid you in developing your malware. And I think again, it just lowers the barrier to entry and makes it more likely that we're going to see attackers doing these things.
Fantastic. Hey, I want to switch again real quick. DARPA award. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and your observations?
Yeah, so DARPA is kind of known for, especially at Black Hat, announcing these prizes, right, to go against whether it's, generating better firewalls or like deep packet inspection. And this year, the award that they announced, or like the competition, right, where you can apply and get a big chunk of money, and then if you're selected, you get an even bigger chunk of money to develop your product, was based on AI, right? How can we apply AI in cybersecurity? So we're already seeing, right, multiple portions of the government talk about AI. I mean, one of the fireside chats, I think, was with the director of CISA as well, where they had talked about AI as well. So this is clearly a problem that the U.S. government is listening to and working on. And, just to talk from the legislative angle, I think listening to some of the folks, on the legislative side, they're saying that by the end of next year, they're actually hoping to have some sort of, legal like bill drafted to actually go over artificial intelligence and what limitations we need to pose on this and restrictions to sort of keep everybody safe.
Yeah, that's right. They were addressing Congress and the administration this week, right? Just on this topic, and as usual, I do think it's regulations always kind of follow the flow of technology, right? So it's always sort of after the fact that somebody has to figure out, once we've invented the car, why we need guardrails and what they should look like, and so on. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if how that how that shapes up over the next little while. So before we start to wrap up here, I got a couple of questions for you. But before that, is there, anything else you wanted to add here just about, summer observations, what's going on, or anything else you saw, like keynotes or anything else at Black Hat?
Yeah, so I'm an infrastructure guy, so I really like that layer two, layer three networking, and I really like to see how different threat actors can abuse this to sort of do bulk exfiltration of data and bulk targeting. And one of the interesting talks was actually from a German PhD student, and he went into some of like that satellite hacking, right? So we know that satellite networks underpin a lot of really critical infrastructure, either because they allow you to get internet access through remote places. You can create virtual private networks, sort of like an MVNO, that rides over the satellite network. And they also offer that reliability, right? That no fail condition, and are often used as failover communications. And in this case, he looked at two different types of CubeSats and another one that's called like the flying laptop. And he had, looked at the security that's actually implemented in these and found that, with maybe about $10,000, you can start hacking satellites, right? You could build
Wow.
your own ground station for $10,000 in parts, and it's not to mention that both AWS and Microsoft's Azure, they actually now offer ground station as a service. I think it's like GSAAS, and everything's a SaaS product now. But you can actually
Of
get
course.
access to ground stations and stuff through cloud infrastructure. So all you need is a credit card. And in this case, looking at them, right, like both of those CubeSats he looked at didn't even implement, really security at the most basic level, right? There were no authentication protocols. They were broadcasting signals without encryption. And it wasn't great. The other one did have encryption and tried to separate interfaces from process execution and stuff, but I mean, it was really just flawed all around. Luckily, these aren't some of the major satellite communication providers, but it does go to show, that this is an issue across that industry. And I think we've seen folks like the Russian APTs, right, use that to sort of do some denial of service attacks against Ukraine during this war.
Right, right. So it sounds kind of like this industry. I'm going to call it SaaS, satellites as a service now. Is um, they're kind of where automotive was years ago, right? When they started to blend, the infotainment section, technology with, the automotive management. I'm not sure what the technical term is, but you know what I mean? Like they think it's actually running the engine and brakes and so on. And, there were certainly, they weren't, air gapped. And, we saw a lot come out around how those things could be abused, or even before that, Barnaby Jack with, all his classic patient wearable med tech hacks that he'd do at Black Hat, where he'd show, how insulin pumps and heart
Yep.
monitors and things could be affected. So I guess this is just the classic, the satellite industry and the latest tech has not learned the lessons, from those businesses. And now, unfortunately, they're probably going through the same cycle.
And a lot of the problem is, especially with something like the satellite, right? These things are floating above the earth a lot of times, not the ground stations, but the satellites themselves. And, they may have been launched years ago, and, the technology wasn't at the same place, right? Like, you can't necessarily upgrade the encryption algorithms that are running off the ASIC chips and stuff in these satellites. So sometimes you're stuck with what you're stuck with, and
Right. Right.
processing power, energy, and stuff is a real limited resource up there. So you have to, be really it's a big trade off. So that's why I think it's also been an issue.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? You're right. It's not a simple, it's not as accessible, I should say, as, ground-based tech, right? Sort of,
Yeah.
you're right. It's what are you going to do, right? There's nothing, you can't update hardware, you can't solve those kind of problems. But fantastic observation there, Kevin. So yeah, so one of the things we're going to introduce here in season 2 of Cybertide is asking sort of 3 rapid fire questions to all of our guests. So the first one is, based on everything you talked about today, what are some of the things that you would recommend that small to medium sized organizations can do to protect themselves?
We talked earlier about sort of the legal statistics, and the legal statistics show, right, in that industry at least, and I'm sure this applies to every industry. The smaller the organization, the less likely it is that they are to have, proper user training. And at this point, there's so many different avenues to get good user training for cybersecurity, via resources online, even if it's a Udemy course or something like that you show to your employees. I think user training, because the user is really the first step in a lot of these compromises with spear phishing and SEO poisoning, clicking malware attachments and stuff. I think the phishing training and the user training is really the number one always.
Right on. Yeah, I'm gonna second that. I do think that's critical. So, question number 2 here: what book or movie do you think maps most to cybersecurity? Please don't say Black Hat.
No, I'm going to say something like Sherlock, honestly, like one of the Sherlock
Nice.
movies, right? Because honestly, doing cybersecurity, whether it's incident response or proactive threat hunting, vulnerability discovery, you kind of act like a detective. And one thing I always like to talk about to my analysts and stuff when I'm training them is that I can't think of the name of it now, but it's that principle that essentially for every action there's a reaction, right? And that they do this a lot in the forensic sciences, where every time you touch something, a criminal touches something, they leave something behind, right? And it's the same in cybersecurity, right? Like every time somebody does something, there's a log generated, there's a file moved, there's a process opened or closed. There's always a reaction for whatever they're doing, and you have to really look for those.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's kind of Newton's third law, right? Action and reaction is what you're talking about there.
Yep.
I agree with you, right? That that's something I say all the time as well is even though you have very sophisticated criminal or adversary groups, the reality is at the end of the day, they still have to do something that will leave a trace, right? That is sort of fundamental in your environment, and we can track it based on that. All right, so last question, kind of what just a lot more fun here is. What's a quote or a rule or, sort of an edict by which you navigate your life?
Man, I'm going to have to say it's just as simple as do the right thing, right? Whether it's going to your grandma's birthday party, and you don't want to drive the hour, or, it's doing right by your customers, you know the right thing, or at least you know the wrong thing. So don't do the wrong thing. At least try to do the right thing.
Fabulous. Yeah, absolutely. Love it. Well, Kevin, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, as it always is. So, any parting words just before we go?
I mean, stay safe out there, everybody. It's a scary landscape. Things are always changing, and really just keep your ear to the ground, see what the newest threats coming up are, and protect yourselves as best you can. And Adlumin and the rest of the cybersecurity industry is here for you.
Oh, Kevin, as always, it's a pleasure. Fabulous job today. Thank you. You've been listening to CyberTide with Mark Sangster. Today we were joined by Kevin O'Connor, Adlumin's Director of Threat Intelligence Research. Join us for future episodes in which we invite more experts to reveal the contributing factors and costs of cyber incidents and how your firm can protect itself from business-disrupting cyber attacks. For more information about Adlumin or for a demo, visit adlumin.com. To order an audio, digital, or print copy of my book, No Safe Harbor, visit mbsangster.com or amazon.com.